Undercover boss grabs coffee at food court cafe, shocked to learn a simple tip can change everything. The morning light had just managed to filter through the large windows of the food court, forming honey-like streaks on the polished tiles. Foster's Market Cafe, tucked away in a corner of the bustling food court, still retained the familiar look that Michael Foster had cherished since the day it first opened. A small bar counter with a faded coffee machine, a few dozen simple, wooden chairs, and the aroma of freshly roasted coffee drifting out like a quiet invitation. The sounds here carried the rhythm of a busy morning. The POS machine beeped steadily its beep like the heartbeat of the cafe, interspersed with the sizzling sounds from neighboring food stalls and the hurried calls of customers jostling to start their day. The aroma of hot coffee mingled with the scent of toasted bread and the faint dampness of the clean-tiled floor, creating an atmosphere both warm and bustling. Michael Foster sat silently in a corner of the cafe, an old gray coat draped loosely over his shoulders, a faded cap pulled low to partially hide his face. He lifted a steaming cup of coffee to his lips, letting the warmth brush against his weathered skin marked by time and the many years spent building Foster's Coffee House. His eyes followed the movements within the cafe, the gaze of a founder, a gaze filled with both pride and the weariness of a stranger among his own creation. He remembered the very first day when Foster's Market Cafe was still just an idea on paper. He had wanted to create a place where every employee felt valued, where even the smallest but most meaningful tips could light up hopeful eyes. Foster's Market Cafe had been built on that belief. The belief that fairness wasn't only in financial reports, but in every smile, every glance shared between people. But that morning, amidst the hustle and bustle of the cafe, Michael felt that something had changed. The lively laughter of old had been reduced to polite greetings. The eyes of the employees behind the barista, counter eyes that once shone as bright as the dawn, now reflected only fatigue and resignation. The neon light from the menu board reflected off their faces, but it wasn't enough to dispel the darkness creeping into every breath. Michael slowly set his coffee cup down on the table, his gaze following a petite girl who carefully placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Anna, the young waitress whose name he'd heard mentioned in HR reports. Her hair was neatly tied back, the strands by her temples trembling slightly with each breath. Her cream apron was frayed at the edges, a testament to countless long shifts. Her eyes under the soft yellow light carried a look that was both weary and glimmering with a faint, fragile hope. Michael paused when he saw that look. For a moment he saw the faces of the young employees from the early days, eyes bright with joy when they received fairly shared tips, eyes filled with the trust that Foster's Market Cafe had once been a place to believe in. But those eyes in Anna's face were now tinged with exhaustion, as if she had to grit her teeth to survive in a system he had never imagined could become so harsh. Anna placed the cup of coffee on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Her voice rang out soft, but enough to cut through the cafe's bustle, piercing Michael's heart like a knife he hadn't expected. Just split the tips fairly, then everyone could afford a meal every day. Michael was stunned. A simple sentence, but it carried a whole world he had never seen. A world where tips weren't just numbers on the POS screen, but actual meals after long shifts, nights where no one went to bed, hungry glimmers of hope for those who had poured their sweat into keeping Foster's Market Cafe's lights on. His eyes dropped. In an instant, he heard his own voice echo in his memory. Here everyone gets their fair share of tips. He had once said it with every ounce of conviction, but now Anna's words were like a mirror, reflecting the gap between his ideals and reality, a gap he had allowed to grow without realizing it. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting Anna's eye palm. In her eyes, he saw the fragile spark of one last hope, the eyes of someone who had endured too long waiting for decency. The neon light reflected off Anna's face, making the sweat on her temple glisten like a crystal. And he knew that it was that tear, that sentence, that look, that had ignited in him an unquenchable resolve. He had to reclaim fairness. He had to reclaim Foster's Market Cafe as it once was. Amid the noise, Michael Foster understood that nothing would be the same again, and only he as the founder could right the wrongs that had twisted it. Michael Foster leaned back in his chair, his eyes following the frantic rhythm of life in Foster's Market Cafe, which had once been his pride and the symbol of his dream of fairness. At 50, his hair had started to gray at the temples, the mark of sleepless nights spent wrestling with revenue figures and growth strategies. But deep inside, he still carried a passionate heart for Foster's Coffee House. He had once believed that Foster's Market Cafe was not just a coffee shop tucked away in a shopping center's food court, but a warm home for every employee. A place where everyone from baristas to waitstaff would be respected, would share fairly in every drop of sweat and every tip from customers. He had written the first lines of the employee guidelines himself, held weekly meetings with the management team reminding them, never lose sight of human dignity because people are the heart of this place. Yet this morning, amid the bustling air, Michael realized something had changed. The neon lights shone down on the pastry counter, highlighting the fresh baked goods and steaming coffee, but also revealing the harsh lines on the employees' faces. The POS machine still beeped steadily, beep beep like the mechanical heartbeat of a soulless machine. Each time the POS sounded, Michael could almost hear the sighs of those standing behind it, the people who had once pinned their dreams on Foster's Market Cafe. Each customer walked past the pastry counter with a bright smile. They took advantage of the morning to pick up their coffee, some toast, and share a few casual stories. The smell of hot coffee mixed with the rich aroma of butter softened the space amidst the busyness. But behind those smiles, behind the greetings to customers, "Welcome, sir, ma'am," Michael noticed something. The employees' eyes had changed. The eyes of the baristas, those young people who once believed this place was the start of their journey to independence, now appeared nervous and exhausted. Some eyes drooped, some avoided his gaze, and some carried a resigned look. Michael felt like he was standing in front of a stage where the bright neon lights only served to hide the weariness behind the scenes. Then his gaze rested on Anna. The petite girl was standing behind the pastry counter, holding a tray of freshly made toast. Her soft brown hair was tied back in a hurry, with a few stray strands sticking to her sweaty forehead. Her cream apron had yellowed at the bottom, bearing the marks of countless busy days. Michael saw the calluses on her fingers, traces of countless shifts of carrying trays, wiping down counters, adjusting the coffee machine. Anna, the young woman Michael had heard the manager mention in meetings. She works very hard but doesn't speak up much. The manager's voice back then had a cold edge to it, as if Anna was just a small part of the machine that kept Foster's Market Cafe running. But today, Michael saw something different. In the cold neon light, Anna appeared as the symbol of everything Foster's Coffee House had once taken pride in: dedication, resilience, but now worn down by unfair shift allocations and manipulated tips. Her eyes still shone with dedication, but behind that calm mask, Michael could read an entire world that had been drained of its energy. The sound of the POS machine rang out repeatedly, each beep like a knife slicing through the air. Michael turned to look at the shift schedule pinned behind the barista counter, where names were slotted into time slots. He noticed a group of employees always got the prime hours, the busy times with high tips. Meanwhile, Anna and a few others were assigned only to the off hours, when the cafe was slow and the tips weren't even enough to buy a lunch. He sighed. Michael remembered the declining revenue reports he'd been reading in recent months. The customer complaints about service quality, about staff attitudes. But at the time, he'd thought of those as just numbers, minor issues that could be resolved with a meeting or a new KPI chart. Only when he heard Anna's words that morning did he realize behind those numbers were fading eyes, sighs that Foster's Market Cafe had never known before. Just split the tips fairly, then everyone could afford a meal every day. That sentence, small but steeped in tears, echoed in Michael's mind like an alarm bell. It reminded him of the first meetings when Foster's Market Cafe was founded of his own promises. We will split tips fairly, whoever works harder will earn more. But the golden light of Foster's in those days had now been stained by the cold blue glow of the POS screen and the neon lights, the light of numbers, of division, of polite smiles instead of real trust. Michael took a deep breath. He knew that today he wasn't just here for a cup of morning coffee, but to see how his brainchild had grown and how it had grown crookedly. And he understood that only he had the courage to lift the curtain, hiding the injustices that had spread across Foster's Market Cafe. Michael lightly squeezed the half-empty cup of coffee, its warmth unable to soothe the cold, slowly seeping into his chest. From where he sat, he watched the barista counter, where the neon lights shone down in strips, illuminating every gesture, every expression, every look of the employees working under strain. His eyes followed every small detail. At the bar, the young barista with light brown hair adjusted his neatly pressed uniform, his smile as bright as stage lights every time a customer approached. His eyes sparkled with confidence, his hands flew over the POS screen like a skilled artist. Each time the POS let out its familiar beep, Michael noticed a faint flash of light in his eyes, a glint of control. That barista was always on shift during peak hours from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., the busiest time with the highest tips. Michael saw him greet customers, smile broadly each time a customer reached for their wallet. Each tip entered into the POS, and he'd glance at the screen with a satisfied look. But then when Michael's gaze shifted to the far end of the pastry counter, he saw Anna. The petite girl with her soft brown hair tied back hurriedly, clutching a cloth, wiping the counter in the same repetitive motion like a machine. On her cream apron, now discolored, a few dry coffee stains clung like marks of time. Under the cold neon lights, Michael saw Anna's face fade, her eyes lost, exhausted. Each time a customer placed an order, Anna would bow her head slightly and smile gently, her voice soft. "Yes, sir, ma'am. What would you like?" But behind that greeting, Michael saw a pair of eyes that had lost their light. No longer the bright eyes from the early days of Foster's Market, cafe eyes that once believed this place was a second home. Now those eyes only reflected resignation. Michael's gaze shifted to the shift schedule posted behind the barista counter. Under the warm yellow light, each name lined up in shifts like soulless numbers. The name of that young barista shone bright during the prime hours every day, every week. Meanwhile, Anna's name, along with a few others, only appeared in the off-peak shifts when the cafe was quiet, the tips so low they weren't even enough to buy a decent meal. Michael vividly remembered the long nights he had spent at his old wooden desk, carefully arranging schedules so that everyone had an equal opportunity. He had once told the manager tips are earned, not a privilege. Yet now those numbers on the schedule had become invisible knives, placing some in the golden hours and pushing others into the quiet shifts, all decided with a single, unfeeling click of a mouse. Michael's gaze fell on the POS system, the system he once proudly saw as transparent as a symbol of sharing. On the day he approved its purchase, he believed it would be the tool to help Foster's Market Cafe uphold the value of fairness. Those who worked hard would reap the rewards. Every tip would go straight to the person who served the customer. But now the pale green glow from the POS reflected off the glass of the bar counter like a mocking grin. He saw the young barista standing behind the POS, his hands moving quickly across the screen, his eyes darting briefly to the group of trusted staff, then back down to adjust something. Michael leaned in, trying to see more clearly. Instead of tips going directly to the name of the server, they were being collected in a holding account from which they were redistributed at the discretion of the management. Michael's heart tightened like a vice. He knew that very system, the one he had once been so proud of for its transparency, had now been twisted into a tool of manipulation. And the ones holding that power were the managers, the very people he had trusted with preserving the values of Foster's Market Cafe. Michael turned his head to look at Anna. She was still standing there, her shoulders trembling with each beep of the POS, her hands holding the tray of pastries trembling. The neon lights reflected on her face like a waning moon, highlighting the fatigue at the corners of her eyes. Amidst the crowd bustling in and out of the cafe, she stood like a dying candle, its weak light flickering with a fragile hope. In that moment, Michael heard himself asking, how did a place that used to be a home for everyone become a place where people like Anna have to grit their teeth just to survive? He recalled the complaints about declining sales, about staff, attitude, all the numbers and reports that had once been placed on the meeting table. But today, a single glance from Anna made him realize behind those numbers was a silent struggle he had never known. Michael swallowed hard. He knew that if he didn't act, Foster's Market Cafe would be left with only the cold beeping of the POS and the neon lights reflecting on the bowed heads of its staff. And he understood that this moment was the beginning of an unveiling where he, Michael Foster, would have to face not just the managers, but also his own conscience. Michael caught a faint glimmer of hope as his eyes landed on a faint line of text on the POS screen, tips distribution holding. His heart pounded, the blood rushed to his face, and for the first time that morning, he rose from his seat and walked straight toward the POS. Every step Michael took echoed on the tile floor like the sound of an unspoken declaration, making the entire cafe freeze for a moment. The young barista behind the POS flinched slightly, his hand hovering over the screen as if frozen in midair. His eyes darted away behind the mask of a polite smile. Michael didn't wait another second. He reached out, cautious but firm, pointing directly at the faint text that had just disappeared when the POS changed screens. That trembling yet determined hand nearly touched the screen itself, as if he was peeling away the mask of the entire system he had once trusted. "What did you just press?" Michael asked, his voice not loud but cold enough to make the air around the bar counter freeze. The young barista stood still. His eyes darted, flitting from Michael to the POS screen, as if seeking an escape from the question. Sweat began to bead on his temple, reflecting the pale green neon light like a sharp, stinging glare. Michael didn't need an answer. He leaned closer to the screen, scrutinizing it, his finger trembling slightly as he scrolled through recent transactions, the tips holding section, and those figures that had been suspiciously consolidated. A part of his memory about the system he had once personally designed came flooding back, every line of code, every setting he had poured his heart into to ensure transparency. And now that very place had become a gateway for deceit. Michael's heart clenched. His hand gently rested on the screen, his eyes sharpening like a blade. He looked straight into the barista's eyes, his voice low and firm. "How exactly are you splitting these tips?" The barista hesitated, his mouth moving, but no words coming out. Behind him, Anna instinctively looked up, her eyes wide, her hand still holding the tray of toast, trembling. Under the mix of warm and neon lights, all eyes seemed to gather in a tight circle around the barista and Michael. In that moment, Michael knew he had officially stepped into the fight to reclaim fairness at Foster's Market Cafe, a fight with no way back. Michael tightened his grip on his coffee mug, his eyes fixed on the POS's glowing screen, displaying its cold numbers. That familiar light now reflected on the young barista's face with a sly, mocking smile, like a blade cutting deep into the trust Michael had built at Foster's Market Cafe. The young barista stood upright, his fingers moving across the POS screen with such practiced speed that an outsider might think he was just doing routine work. But Michael knew. He saw the barista's eyes dart toward Anna standing at the pastry counter, and that glance couldn't hide its defiance. "These tips belong to us." Michael suddenly heard a soft laugh somewhere, like cold metal scraping past his ears, sending shivers down his spine. The young barista's eyes seemed to glow as his finger touched the Consolidate Tips button on the POS screen, where customers' grateful tokens were gathered into a single pile and then redistributed at management's whim. Michael's heart ached. A memory surged back, the days when he personally distributed every tip to the staff, carefully noting each person's name, making sure that those who worked the hardest earned the most. He remembered the bright eyes of the young barista's eyes that sparkled like the morning stars, eyes that had now vanished, replaced by bowed heads of resignation, sidelong glances, or glimmers of calculation. Michael swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as his gaze shifted to Anna. Amidst the cold mechanical beeps of the POS machine, she stood still like a curtain separating two worlds. Her hands moved quickly to clean the pastry counter, but Michael noticed that every so often she would glance toward the POS, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. Then, in a moment that seemed to slow down, Michael saw Anna pull a worn-out notebook from her apron pocket, its pages frayed at the edges. Her hands shook as she opened the notebook, the neon light reflecting off the smudged ink, the lines hastily written in tiny, cramped letters. Michael squinted, his heart tightening, as he realized tips being adjusted, unfair shift schedules, threatening messages from management, all the things he had once trusted without question were now evidence of a corrupt system. He saw fresh blue ink in some places, with certain lines pressed harder perhaps, because her hand had trembled too much when she wrote. Anna's eyes shone with fear but also glistened with a hidden resolve, a quiet strength of someone standing up to protect what was right. Michael felt his throat go dry. A wrenching question echoed in his mind. How long has she been fighting this system alone without crying out for help? He could see every drop of sweat forming on her forehead, sliding down, blending with the smell of coffee, pastries, and the humid air of the bustling food court. Amidst the chatter of customers, the steady beeps of the POS machine, Michael could hear his own heart pounding like an alarm bell. Foster's Market Cafe had once been a home of fairness and sharing, but now it was becoming a stage for a group of people to manipulate with cold, calculated button presses. He remembered Anna's eyes as she placed his coffee cup on the table that morning. Those eyes had ignited everything. And now that little notebook was the evidence of her courage, of the hope that she and others like her had not yet given up. Michael took a silent, deep breath, his eyes no longer those of an ordinary customer. They were the eyes of a founder standing at the threshold between an old dream and a harsh reality. He understood that this moment wasn't just one to witness, but one to act. A drop of coffee fell onto the cloth on the table, soaking into a brown stain, like a drop of blood silently seeping from the heart of Foster's Market Cafe. Michael looked at that stain, his hand tightening around the coffee cup, silently vowing, justice must be restored. The light must return to her eyes and to all the eyes that once believed Foster's was their home. And in that instant, Michael Foster, founder of Foster's Coffee House, understood he himself had to be the one to put an end to this fraudulent tipping scheme and bring everything back to the fair system it had been in the beginning. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on Anna's hand as she scribbled in her notebook. In that moment, he knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. He quickly made his way to the pastry counter, his heart pounding, and stopped right in front of her. Anna looked up, her eyes meeting his gaze, trembling as if she'd just been caught doing something wrong. But Michael simply gave a small, sad but determined smile. He reached out gently, placing his hand on the edge of the old notebook, his voice low and firm as steel. "Let me see what you're writing, Anna." She flinched her hand, trembling so much that the pen nearly fell from her grasp. Her eyes darted to his a mix of fear and hope. Michael didn't let her hesitate any longer. He nodded his eyes, conveying a silent promise, "You're not alone." Anna paused for a breath, then with the courage of someone exhausted from injustice, she opened the notebook, her hands trembling violently. Michael leaned in closer, his eyes scanning quickly over the messy lines, the numbers, the hastily crossed-out notes. Every line felt like a knife cutting into his heart, and the more he read, the more he felt betrayed by the very values he once thought were unshakable. One note stopped him cold: 7 a.m., 10 a.m., highest tips, always for the favored group. Right below that, POS tips, pooled manager approval. Michael's heart felt like it was being crushed. It wasn't just the money, it was the very dream of fairness at Foster's that had been twisted. He turned to Anna, looking deeply into her eyes, his gaze now a fire burning bright. "You did good," he said, his voice low and decisive. "You showed me the truth, and now it's my turn to do the rest." He closed the notebook, gripping it tightly like a shield for all the eyes that had been taken advantage of. Without another word, he turned, his eyes fixed on the POS where the cold beep still rang out. His breathing grew heavy, his steps slow but unwavering. Foster's Market Cafe had never witnessed a moment like this. And Michael knew from here nothing would be the same again. Michael stood up abruptly. The chair let out a small creak enough to freeze the entire cafe in that moment. The yellow neon lights shone down on his face, highlighting the determined lines of a founder who had dedicated his whole life to building Foster's Market Cafe. He strode towards the barista counter, his eyes cold and resolute. Each step seemed to vibrate through the air. The POS machine's beeps fell silent, and the usual cafe sounds, the clinking of spoons, the chatter of customers, vanished. Michael stood up straight, facing the group of managers standing behind the counter. The blue light from the POS screen cast a glow on the manager's face, revealing beads of sweat rolling down his temples. Those eyes, the same eyes that once looked at Michael with respect, were now lowered shoulders trembling with fear. Michael didn't need a microphone. His voice rang out sharp yet steady, cutting through the air that felt as tight as a drawn bowstring. "These are the sweat and efforts of all of you, stolen by the very managers who were supposed to protect them. From today, every shift will be distributed fairly." The entire cafe held its breath, the eyes of customers, of employees, all fixed on Michael. In that moment, he was no longer just a man sitting quietly in a corner with an old baseball cap. He was Michael Foster, the founder, the guardian, the one who held the true values of Foster's Market Cafe. The barista manager lowered his head, his lips pressed tight until they turned white. His hands still rested on the POS, fingers trembling slightly, as if with a light touch everything could be hidden again. But Michael wouldn't let that happen. He leaned forward, placing his hand firmly yet calmly on the POS screen, as if erasing all the hidden schemes. "I once stood right here personally, distributing every single tip to the staff so that no one would be left behind." Michael said, his voice ringing like a bell heralding a new dawn. "But today you've turned this tool of transparency into a weapon to steal the sweat of others. I won't let that continue for even one more second." Anna stood silent by the pastry counter, her eyes brimming with tears, lashes trembling. A single tear slid down her cheek, glistening like a crystal under the neon light. It wasn't just a tear of resentment, but a tear of hope, of justice, of a day she had waited for far too long. Michael turned his eyes, meeting each staff member who stood frozen watching. His gaze was like a slow-burning fire, sending warmth into every heart. "You all deserve to be treated fairly," he said, his voice both warm and firm as forged steel. "And from today on, Foster's Market Cafe will once again be your home, a place where every drop of sweat is rewarded as it should be." A sigh of relief, as if releasing years of pent-up tension, sounded from the end of the barista counter. A young staff member quickly wiped away a tear, his eyes suddenly brighter, as if finding the strength to stand tall amid the injustices that had once crushed every hope. POS glowed blue, the screen's light reflecting off the manager's face. That light no longer held the same power as before. Now it was merely the glow of a machine stripped of its fraudulent facade. Michael looked straight at the manager, his voice firm. "Fairness is not an option. It is the foundation of everything I built, and I will personally restore it." In that moment, Foster's Market Cafe was not just a coffee shop. It was a small flame, a storm, a wake-up call for anyone who had ever believed they could manipulate it. Michael stood there, his eyes shining like dawn after a long night, and under the warm yellow neon lights, Foster's Market Cafe returned to its true meaning, a home of fairness and sharing. The neon lights from the food court shone down on the Foster's Market Cafe glass, reflecting on faces now beaming. This morning, the barista counter no longer rang with the heavy beep of manipulated transactions. The POS was now just a tool, no longer a cold power that divided workers as it had yesterday. Anna stood there at the pastry counter, her eyes shining under the light, like the morning star in the night sky. On her chest, her new name tag sparkled Anna Shift Supervisor. Her worn cream apron was now neatly pressed, her collar tidy, like her proud smile at that moment. Michael stood silently behind the barista counter, his hand still resting on the now renewed POS. He had just finished a brief meeting with the manager, a meeting with no paperwork, no reports, just eyes meeting eyes and one simple order. Tips must be transparent, shifts must be fair. Michael's voice still lingered in the air, blending with the hiss of the coffee machine and the lively chatter of customers. Here we're not just selling coffee. We're selling hope, trust, and the opportunity for everyone to have a decent meal after a shift. From the end of the counter, Anna stepped toward Michael, her hand holding the old notebook. The pages once smudged with ink, now closed like a sealed diary, but it had become a symbol of everything Foster's Market Cafe had just endured. Anna looked up at Michael, her eyes like the sunrise, gentle, strong, and full of gratitude. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice trembling but confident. "Not just for me, but for everyone here." Michael nodded gently, his hand resting on her shoulder in a silent congratulation. In that light, he saw Foster's Market Cafe coming back, not through numbers on a revenue report, but through the bright eyes of people who once bowed their heads in silence and could now smile with pride. In the middle of the pastry counter, the new shift schedule was posted, the handwriting bold and clear. No more peak hours reserved for the inner circle, no more cold lines reading tips held in escrow. Now every shift was fairly divided, and everyone knew exactly how much tips they had earned. A single tip, small as it was enough to buy someone a decent lunch, enough to brighten their smile after a long shift. Michael watched Anna instruct a new employee on the proper way to brew coffee, her eyes radiating confidence, her hands moving skillfully, the neon light reflecting off her pink-tinged cheeks. He remembered Anna's eyes that morning, once adrift, now the eyes of a guide. He stood silently, his hand lightly touching the POS, his gaze following every movement as if recording each drop of sweat, each smile, each glance that marked the rebirth of Foster's Market Cafe. Inside him echoed a soft voice. All it took was a click on the POS, just one short meeting to change an entire system. The neon lights of the food court still shone brightly, but that light no longer felt so harsh and cold. It now reflected on Anna's radiant smile, illuminating a picture of a morning sunrise, a place where hope had been rekindled, where sweat was rewarded with fairness and respect. Michael stood there, his eyes fixed on Anna and the employees working around her. Each one had a story, a drop of sweat, a flicker of hope, and he, the founder of Foster's Coffee House, had rediscovered the true meaning of what he once called the second home. Inside him echoed a quiet whisper, a sentence he had cherished for many years, now finally finding its place. A single tear changed the entire system. He knew Foster's Market Cafe was not just a place that sold coffee. It was a place that sold hope, trust, and fairness, things that could never be measured by revenue numbers. Fairness isn't found in revenue reports. It's in the way we treat the people who shed their sweat and tears to build this place.